So one of the first articles you're going to read for the class is an article by a famous historian named Howard Zinn, who wrote a book called The People's History of the United States. And not to give too much away what the article is about, but the purpose of the book is to sort of look at history through the lens of not necessarily political leaders, not necessarily those who conquer, but those who maybe are more of the common person, or maybe, rather than talking about things through the perspective of Native Europeans, maybe look at things from the perspective of a Native American. Instead of looking at the slaveholders like Thomas Jefferson, you take a look at how slaves felt. So for example, in this particular article, which is chapter 1, we're going to start at the beginning with Columbus. Now, most of you probably know Columbus and what he's done, and when you look at the title, it says Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. And what you might want to do when you look at a title is try to maybe take a guess as to where the article is going to be going. So, and ask not only questions about what the article is about, but establish what you already know. So, for example, you may not know what they mean by human progress. And that might be an open question for you, but you may know who Columbus is, at least on the surface, because you learned about him in elementary school, maybe in middle school. You kind of know some of the positive impacts he's had in terms of discovering the New World for Europe, and then opening up the gate for colonization that then led to eventually the United States, though not directly. So what we're going to do is Ms. McGrover is going to read through chapter 1, and I'm going to stop her occasionally and discuss what she read, and kind of talk about maybe things that you may want to annotate. Now, just to be clear, that this article does have a very specific purpose, and you should always be trying to figure out what the purpose of the things that you're reading is. So when you are reading it, though it doesn't have a thesis statement at the end of the introduction the way that maybe your essays would, you do need to sort of keep an eye out for what the point of the essay is. So if all the information is being presented to you, it's building up to a thesis, and at some point in this article, he's going to lay it out for you, and it will become very clear if you're actively trying to piece together what point he's trying to make. Okay, so here we go.
Chapter 1, Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. Arawak men and women, naked, tawny, and full of wonder, emerged from their villages onto the island's beaches and swam out to get a closer look at the strange big boat. When Columbus and his sailors came ashore, carrying swords, speaking oddly, the Arawaks ran to greet them, brought them food, water, gifts. He later wrote of this in his log. They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want.
Okay, so we're going to stop right there because there's a lot of information that's being presented, but there are some basic facts that he's trying to put across to the reader. Now, the first thing you may want to highlight, because this is of great importance, is the name of the native peoples that we're going to be talking about, who are the Arawaks, right? So just highlighting it to establish that this is the native people that we're talking about. You also might want to take a look at what is going on when they first meet. So, for example, what are the first observations Columbus is making about these people, and what is maybe surprising about his response? So he meets these natives, he sees them, and what does he say? What is his final evaluation of them? He says, with 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Now ask yourself, is that something that you would expect somebody to say who we celebrate as often as we do, once every October, once a year? That seems to be something that goes against a lot of what we may popularly know about Christopher Columbus. So you may want to make some kind of remark like, I don't know, just maybe a question mark and exclamation point, because you're like sort of surprised by it. Something to say like, this is something of interest. This is something I might want to revisit during discussion. There may be a question you have that you might want to write there. It doesn't have to be anything profound, but just making a note that this is something that I didn't hear about when I was growing up. This is something that sort of takes me by surprise. Emotionally responding to making a note that you're emotionally responding to the text. All right, so we are going to continue after this posts, and we're just going to click out of it.
These Arawaks of the Bahama Islands were much like Indians on the mainland, who were remarkable, European observers were to say again and again, for their hospitality, their belief in sharing. These traits did not stand out in the Europe of the Renaissance, dominated as it was by the religion of popes, the government of kings, the frenzy for money that marked Western civilization and its first messenger to the Americas, Christopher Columbus.
Okay, so the next paragraph is serving a purpose where they are now comparing and contrasting European culture with this new culture that Europeans are coming into contact with. So you might notice that there's a contrast between the government of kings, the frenzy for money, for example, and then also that there's this hospitality. There's this hospitality that's being is present in Native American life that's not necessarily present in the money frenzy life of the Europeans. And so what you want to do is you might want to like mark down you know government of kings to sort of, it's an interesting phrase referring to the Europeans of the Renaissance, because this is going on during the Renaissance, which is something you may want to take note of. And you might also want to take note of the fact that these people are known for their hospitality. But the other thing, too, that's important in this paragraph is it establishes a sense of place. That Columbus actually went to the Bahama Islands, and you might want to make a note of that by suggesting that Columbus landed in the Bahamas. Not necessarily North America. And I only say that because Columbus, while he discovered the continents here, by coming here, he didn't necessarily land in what we call the United States today. That there is his discovery is indirect in terms of North America. Okay, so the other thing that I neglected to say before, and I probably should go back to, is that there are certain words that may not appear to be clear to you as to what they mean. So, for example, if you go all the way back up to the first line, you have the word tawny, right? So you could, for example, make a different notation. So if you're using sticky notes, for example, you could, or different colored highlighters, you could use, so in this case I'm using blue to say, I don't know what that means, I have to go back and look it up, maybe make an index card for your vocab. And you could do the same for subjugate, right? So I'm not sure if I can do a highlight over a highlight, but you get the idea. Trying to look over the text to see if there's anything else you guys may not know, and it looks okay. But again, if you find any word that you may not know, I would give it some special designation. Make an index card for your vocab, so you are keeping a log of words that you're encountering that you don't know, and then discovering them for yourself, like figuring out what they mean and how they work in the process here. All right.
Columbus wrote, "As soon as I arrived in the Indies, on the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force, in order that they might learn and might give me information of whatever there is in these parts."
Okay. So one of the things is that historians oftentimes use quotes to give information to the reader. Now, everybody writes with a purpose, or at least good writers write with purpose. So the question you have to ask yourself is, why is this quote, of all the things that Columbus wrote, and all the logs that he wrote, and all the memoirs he wrote, and all the letters that he wrote, why this particular quote is being presented to you? And you have to read the quote, and you have to kind of figure out, like, what is this that I'm reading, that, like, what is this doing to my perception of Columbus? How is this changing how I view Columbus? And at least when I first read this article, what I was sort of taken aback by was his willingness and sort of free-spiritedness to sort of just take people by force and sort of make them do whatever they want. And then that to me kind of stuck out at me. So when I first read this, I underlined this quite a few times. Taking natives by force. And so this also contradicts, and this is something you're going to have to learn how to do over time, something Columbus had already said. He was amazed at how hospitable these people were, right? So he goes on and on to say how polite they were. They gave away all their. So why is he taking these people by force? Now, this is a question I do not have an answer for, but maybe a question you might want to ask when you're going through the article, and that would be a perfect opportunity to make an annotation to say, why was Columbus taking people by force if they were so willing to help people? Or, well, yeah, if by they I mean the Arawaks. If the Arawaks were so willing to help. This is a question that would open up a lot of discussion. People obviously wouldn't know, but we could take guesses. We could look at the evidence and maybe draw different conclusions, and maybe people would agree or disagree. All right.
Okay, so just to sum up, what you're looking for when you annotate, some very important key points, is that you always want to look for vocab. And Mr. Kenny brought up the fact that when you're doing that, highlight in a different color. You can use different color post-it notes, different colored pens, different colored highlighters to give yourself a code so that way you can understand and organize your own annotation. So look for vocab. Another important point. Respond to direct text that challenges your prior understanding. You might think that you know something, and then something is said in a text that you might want to further pull out, or it challenges what you already think. Note that. The third important point to remember is that you want to make notes in your annotations of observations and, most importantly, questions that you have about the reading. The fourth point that you want to make here is to highlight important terms that help you understand the time and place of the work. An example of that is where Mr. Kenny highlighted the Bahama Islands, the European Renaissance, the type of Native Americans we were talking about, the Arawaks, okay? And the final important point for annotation is to always continue to look for the purpose of the article. You don't want to just read to read, you want to read for that purpose. So what Mr. Kenny and I are going to let you do is to continue reading this article and continue to look for that purpose and see if you can identify it on your own.